Okay, so we have two more elements of culture that I want to take a look at. Next up is values. Values are culturally specific standards by which people assess desirability, goodness, rightness, beauty, anything. We judge everything, and so values are culturally defined standards for those sorts of things. Uh, values tell us what is good, what is desirable, and we're encouraged to strive for the good, the desirable, and so on. So in that way, values serve as broad guidelines for social living. And like the other components of culture, these values are socially constructed and agreed upon by most people in a society. How do we know this? Well, when it comes to values, we find evidence in many, many polls that the government or researchers sort of, send out that ask for, public opinion and values and attitudes toward anything and everything in the world. Now, I tried to find a recent kind of opinion poll, and most of the opinion polls right now are about America and the U.S., and I didn't want to go down that road. But I did find this one here from, I think, a couple years ago. An opinion poll. There's a company that does opinion polls all the time and did a survey of Canadians, particularly around the ascension of King Charles to the throne, and and thus, as we're a Commonwealth nation, also sort of associated here with Canada here. So when King Charles, became king after the death of Queen Elizabeth there, um, it was an opportunity for researchers to ask, people, Canadians, how they feel about the monarchy and that sort of thing. And interesting, and so here's just some of the opinion polls here, specifically asking about the values that the royal, family has. Do they, what do people think of that? And as the little title here says, most Canadians say that royals represent outdated modern values. So there's a sort of conflicting, set of values of what's, important and good, here in Canada that we don't see also reflected within, what we think the monarchy represents in that particular way. So this is just one way that we get a sense of, kind of what are the values of Canadians. Jump forward, I think, a couple of years, and so this was, I think, earlier this year, spring of 2025. There, King Charles was in our news again, and this was as a result of the tariffs that the U.S. government was imposing on American companies for importing foreign goods into the U.S. And during that time, King Charles made a visit to Canada and did a throne speech. And I find it interesting. He's sort of alluding to here Canadian values in his speech. And particularly, Canada always, takes, pride in setting an example and its values and, being a force for good, and this notion and values of being strong and free. So these are core Canadian values of currently here. Now, jump from the king to your own clothing here. Going back to our example of clothing here to try and illustrate some of these cultural components here. Um, a question for you would be, what role might values play in your clothing choices that you're reflecting on here as we go through this lesson here? So what role might values play in your clothing choices today? Trying to sort of, guide you toward that. Thinking about kind of how we talk about clothing and the type of, fashion and that people engage in. We have different sort of, values associated with clothing. So, for example, I've heard people talk about being thrift store chic, so making sure that you don't spend a lot of money on your clothes, but you can do so. You can buy clothes, say at the thrift store or secondhand store, and still be cool and fashionable. So there's values, there's sort of intended meanings about, what's appropriate, what's desirable, what's cool. What's cool is a value as well. Um, I have also heard in different contexts, someone being referred to as a label whore, so someone who really, wants that status symbol of a label, of, designers and that sort of thing. But, to call someone a whore usually is not a good thing. So that is also, just that is a reflection of what might be some important values that that person might be violating. They're going against the norm, which is actually our next cultural element here. So again, think about some values that you think might be reflected in your clothing choices, and what standards you might be trying to live up to, or at the same time, maybe given your age, maybe going against those standards and the rules that adults in our society set for us. So, because that's a very much a part of kind of youth subculture, is to kind of do the opposite of what, adult culture, is dictating by its different rules and standards. All right, let's look at the last element of culture here. And this is kind of two things, but they're really similar. They need one another. It's norms and sanctions. So norms are essentially the rules that exist in society. And in many cases, the rules support and protect some of our more important values within society. But mainly norms are simply the rules or established standards of behavior. They tell us what we must do, or what is appropriate and acceptable behavior. They tell us what's forbidden, what's inappropriate behavior. So they're rules, for what we do, from everything, very minor up to more serious things when we think of, say, crimes, for example. Now, maintaining the norms are sanctions. So if you correctly follow a particular norm, you might receive a positive sanction. If you so you behave in a good way, you might get praise. Someone might speak very highly of you. You get positive attention. If you break a norm, and you violate a norm, or you don't live up to a particular rule, you'll experience negative sanctions. So negative sanctions can vary from a mild reminder and just a little talking to be careful, or it could be more formal and more severe, serious punishments. So it depends on the norm. So if it's an informal norm, the sanction negative sanction will be very informal and mild, but if it's a more formal and serious norm or rule, the punishments can be much more serious. So definitely, we let's see, an example could be, we have informal norms that it's not polite to gossip about another person behind their back. But if you do that, then, someone might have, tell you, no, I'm disappointed in you that you're doing that, try to do better next time. So very informal sanction. On the other hand, a more serious norm might be assaulting or uh, someone. Um, and depending on how hard you assault them, you could be breaking a code offense of assault. And with that, then it's more serious, um, and from you could actually serve some jail time if the assault was serious enough. So informal norms and sanctions are just a degree of difference in terms of severity. Um, Now, we have a couple of different types of norms. One of them is we call folkways. Folkways are very informal, everyday norms. They have little moral or ethical significance. So if they're broken and violated, not too much of a big deal. And actually, these norms, folkways, can be broken on certain occasions without serious consequences. So folkways include things like our table manners, the bodily gestures that we make in certain settings, and they include also the rules for how we dress. As well. So back to our clothing example. So again, try and think about what might be some of the informal, simple rules for the clothing choices that you followed or maybe didn't follow in choosing the clothing that you wore on the particular day that you're thinking about here. So pause the video if you need a little bit of time to think about that. I'll cover some of potential folkway norms for clothing here. So some folkway norms for clothing might include, style rules, in terms of, not wearing white after Labor Day is an informal folkway norm around clothing. Not wearing black socks with white shoes, is an informal norm. A rule that you shouldn't mix different types of patterns. So wear polka dots with plaid, is a rule. So those would be very informal folkway norms. You could break them. Nothing bad really is going to happen to you. Maybe some mild sanctions. People might look at you funny or say things or laugh at you, but really minor sanctions in that way. Some other folkway norms associated with clothing might be if different folkway norms could be set for clothing by different groups or subgroups within society. And so you're probably aware of age appropriate clothing, and particularly the fact that what might be appropriate for you to wear based upon your age and your young age might not be appropriate for someone who is in their 70s or their 80s. So those are folkway norms related to clothing. Likewise, gender appropriate rules for what are clothing, what are proper things to wear given your gender identity. So again, as I said, a person can break a folkway norm with little consequence. They might be considered ill-mannered, rude, or foolish, or just socially inept or incompetent in a significant way. Now, folkways are one type of norm. Another type of norm we call mores. And so I know this looks just like Moors, but it's pronounced mores, like the eel, in a way to remember that. So a social more, is a cultural norm of great conventional significance. Mores are norms deemed to be highly necessary for the welfare of a society and its members, and often they embody the most cherished principles or beliefs or values of a society. So some examples of mores would include things like lying, stealing property from another person, bullying people, cheating. Those would be more mores. Really kind of the best examples of mores are, think of behavior that if someone saw you committing, they would call the police, or they would call your parents, or they would call the principal of the school, or other important people. And then there would be very serious, consequences for engaging in that behavior. So bullying or assaulting another person does, as I already said, come potentially, if you're guilty and the harm is enough, it could come with jail time. Now, hopefully you're not breaking any significant mores with your clothing choices here. So I'll give you an example though. And it is there, potentially a crime related to clothing, or rather the lack of clothing. So one crucial social moray is that all members of our society are expected to appear in public places wearing clothes. And if you don't, and you go out into public naked, you could be arrested under Section 174 of the Criminal Code of Canada, which, as you copied it here, anyone who appears, without any excuse, I'm not sure what the lawful excuses might be, but if you appear nude in a public place or nude and exposed to public view, even if you're on your own private property, you're guilty of a crime. And the punishment for that is so it's not stated here, but it's called a summary conviction, which means you could potentially serve 2 years less a day in jail. More often than not, there might be a fine associated with this offense if a person is it could be a $2,000 fine. Actually, sorry, so it's a summary conviction. However, actually, the government has declared that you could only serve potentially a maximum 6 months in jail, or a $2,000 fine. So that would be an example of moray as it applies to clothing rules. Lastly, there is a sort of a subgroup of mores called taboos. So the most serious of mores are taboos, and their violation is considered to be extremely offensive, even unmentionable. And so when it comes to the best examples of taboos would be things like incest or child sexual abuse. Those would be, taboos in our culture. Okay, so that's all the elements of the of culture here. I'm just going to show you the journal post questions, because you potentially could use some of that information to answer question 1 for the journal this week for this topic here. So due on March 30th here. And so question 1, this hopefully starting to become familiar. You're going to see this every journal post section. So taking that current issue or the event that you selected to answer in journal post 1, pick any concept, any point from this whole topic, from culture, not just this video, it could be any of the other videos, but in case it's this video, and just, fit it into, something you could potentially say or ask about that issue or event that you that you identified early in the course here. So I've given you a potential example just to maybe get you started. So does that event or issue involve any cultural elements at all? So does it involve language or values? So an example would be, I gave you that example of King Charles, speaking at the Canada Parliament, throwing speech, and I used that as an example of values. That was connected up to broader, current issue being US Canadian, breakdown of their relationship that's existed for hundreds of years, nevertheless. So that would be an example of how you could use a cultural element there. So that's the journal post. Again, you can use anything from this culture chapter, reading, or lecture material for that.